Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We all praise the historic decision by President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as our capital and to move the embassy there of the world's biggest power. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, America.
As Israel begins to mark the 70th anniversary of the country's founding, Israeli troops continue to crack down on Palestinian protests in Gaza. Over the past 3 weeks, Israeli forces have killed 33 Palestinians and wounded nearly 4,300. We'll speak with Palestinian-American professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University. Then to Syria.
We're very much aware of the delay that the regime imposed on that delegation, but we are also very much aware of how they have operated in the past to conceal what they have done using chemical weapons. In other words, using the pause after a strike like that to try to clean up the evidence before the investigating team gets in. So it was unfortunate they were delayed.
As UN inspectors attempt to reach the site of an alleged Syrian chemical weapons attack, we look at the escalating crisis in Syria. We'll speak with Mozam Beg, a former Guantanamo prisoner who's traveled to Syria to investigate the U.S. rendition program, as well as speak with former prisoners of the Assad regime. Then we'll look at why America's black mothers and babies are in a life-or-death crisis. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump said Wednesday he's looking forward to planned talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, but said he's prepared to walk away from the table if he's not happy with how they're proceeding. Trump's comments came as U.S. and North Korean officials solidified plans for an unprecedented summit between the two leaders, likely to be held in Mongolia's capital. On Wednesday, Trump took to Twitter to praise his CIA chief, Mike Pompeo, for secretly meeting with Kim Jong-un Easter weekend. The praise was widely seen as a bid to boost Pompeo's bid to become Secretary of State, as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is poised to reject his nomination. President Trump demurred Wednesday when asked if he was moving to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller, even as he called the investigation into alleged ties between the Trump Organization and Russian officials a hoax. Trump was speaking in a joint news conference with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach, Florida.
This is a hoax. As far as the investigation, nobody has ever been more transparent than I have instructed our lawyers. Be totally transparent. I believe we've given them 1.4 million pages of documents, if you can believe this, and haven't used, that I know of, or for the most part, presidential powers or privilege. So we are hopefully coming to the end. It is a bad thing for our country, very, very bad thing for our country, but there has been no collusion.
Trump's comments came as Iowa Republican Chuck Grassley, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said he would move ahead with hearings on bipartisan legislation that would protect Special Counsel Mueller. The Senate's Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has vowed he will not bring the measure to a vote in the full Senate. This comes as police in at least one major U.S. city are preparing for possible riots if President Trump fires Robert Mueller. A memo from Pittsburgh Police Commander Victor Joseph reads, quote, "Beginning April 19th, all major crimes detectives are required to bring a full uniform and any issued protective equipment, riot gear, with them to work until further notice. We may be needed in the event that there is a large-scale protest." The Senate moved Wednesday to end an Obama-era policy that warns auto lenders against discriminating against people of color by charging them more on auto loans. West Virginia Democrat Joe Manchin joined Republican senators in a 51-47 vote to overrule the policy by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an agency that's been assailed by Republicans since its creation in 2010. The House is expected to approve the bill and to send it to President Trump for a signature. The rule was adopted after a 2011 report by the Center for Responsible Lending found African Americans and Latinos disproportionately receive interest rate markups more frequently and to a greater degree than their white counterparts. The Senate's approved a rule change that will allow nursing mothers to bring infants to the Senate floor during votes and to breastfeed them inside the chamber. The rule change comes after Illinois Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth became the first U.S. senator to give birth while in office. Duckworth has not been present in Senate votes since the birth of her daughter, Miley Pearl Bowlesby, earlier this month. In Puerto Rico, most of the island's 1.4 million residents are without power after an excavator downed a transmission line Wednesday, blacking out the entire electrical grid for the U.S. territory. The latest blackout comes after hundreds of thousands of residents went for months without power in the wake of Hurricane Maria last fall, and less than a week after another blackout left more than 800,000 Puerto Ricans temporarily without electricity. In Syria, a UN security team with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has delayed its inquiry into an alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma after members of the team were shot at by unknown assailants as they approached the site. The latest delay to the inspectors' mission came amidst competing claims about whether chemical weapons were to blame for the deaths of at least 40 people in the Damascus suburb of Douma on April 7th and over who was responsible. President Trump cited the alleged attack as his rationale for a coordinated U.S., British, and French attack on Syria last Friday. We'll have more on Syria after headlines with Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi and Mozambique. In the Israeli-occupied West Bank, press freedom groups are expressing alarm over the arrest of a journalist early Wednesday by Palestinian security forces. Relatives say the officers presented a search warrant and arrested Hazem Nasser without mention of what charge he's being held on. Nasser works for the Naja broadcasting channel, which frequently covers Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes, the arrests of Palestinians, and the condition of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. In a statement, the Committee to Protect Journalists said, quote, "The authorities must explain immediately on what grounds they snatched this journalist away from his home in the middle of the night." In Cuba, President Raul Castro is stepping down today and will hand power to his hand-picked successor, Miguel Diaz-Canel. Castro will remain head of Cuba's ruling Communist Party. The 57-year-old Diaz-Canel comes to power as the Trump administration seeks to reverse a thaw in relations between the U.S. and Cuba begun under President Barack Obama. In Kansas, a federal jury convicted 3 white male militia members Wednesday of plotting to massacre Somali immigrants at a mosque and an apartment building in Garden City. Gavin Wright, Patrick Stein, and Curtis Allen were found guilty of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction after an FBI informant said they were plotting to use guns and car bombs to mass murder Somalis. The 3 belonged to a militia called the Crusaders. At trial, their lawyer admitted the trio referred to Muslims as cockroaches, but argued they hadn't meant to go through with their plot. In Minnesota, an FBI whistleblower who leaked classified information about how the Bureau aggressively targets potential informants pleaded guilty Tuesday to charges of unauthorized disclosure. Terry J. Albury, who was the only African-American agent at the FBI's field office in Minneapolis, called his leaks an act of conscience aimed at calling out racism at the Bureau. He faces up to 10 years in prison, but is likely to receive less than 5 under a plea deal. In Georgia, immigrants imprisoned at a for-profit detention center have filed a class-action lawsuit claiming they were forced to work for $8 a day or less in violation of U.S. labor law. The suit alleges prisoners at the Stewart Detention Center in Lumpkin, Georgia, who refused to join so-called voluntary work programs face retaliation by guards, including threats of criminal prosecution. One former prisoner says he worked 8-hour shifts in the prison's kitchen for up to 7 days per week, earning just $4 per day. He says when he refused to work, he was put in solitary confinement for 10 days. The prison is operated by Core Civic, formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America. New York State will restore voting rights to thousands of felons on parole under an executive order signed by Governor Andrew Cuomo Wednesday. Civil rights lawyer Myrna Perez of the Brennan Center for Justice welcomed the order, writing in a statement, quote, "New York State's disenfranchisement policy is rooted in historical racism, a shameful extension of 19th century efforts to intentionally block black men from casting ballots, and today depriving Americans on parole of the right to vote continues to have a drastic impact on the people of color," she wrote. In Poland, environmentalists are celebrating after Europe's highest court ordered an immediate halt to large-scale logging in one of the continent's last pristine forests. Tuesday's ruling by the European Union Court of Justice found Poland violated European Union laws by allowing as many as 100,000 ancient trees to be logged in the Białowieska forest. Following the ruling, Greenpeace and other forest protectors have demanded Poland's government drop charges against 300 activists arrested during protests against the illegal logging. In Great Britain, protesters blocked entry to Canada's main embassy in London Wednesday, erecting a mock oil pipeline marked with the words Trudeau Oil. The protest came as Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau arrived in London for talks with Prime Minister Theresa May. The demonstrators want Trudeau to end his support for an expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline, which would accelerate oil shipments from Canada's tar sands region to a terminal near Vancouver. This is UK Greenpeace Program Director Pat Venditti.
Tar sands oil is amongst the dirtiest fossil fuels on the planet. It's dirtier than coal. And Prime Minister Trudeau is here in London to talk about climate responsibility. And our message to Mr. Trudeau is that climate leaders don't build pipelines.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Palestinian protests against the Israeli occupation are continuing this week as Israel begins to mark the country's 70th anniversary of its founding in 1948. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, Israeli forces have killed 33 Palestinian protesters over the past 3 weeks since the Great March of Return protests began to commemorate the mass expulsion of Palestinians during Israel's establishment. Palestinian authorities estimate nearly 4,300 Palestinians have been injured in the peaceful protests. Many were shot with live ammunition or rubber-coated steel bullets. Gaza authorities have also accused Israel of deliberately targeting journalists and medics. Since the protests began, one journalist, Yasser Murtaja, was killed and 66 journalists were injured. In addition, 44 medics have been wounded and 19 ambulances were reportedly targeted.
The protest marches are set to last until May 15th, recognized as the official Israeli Independence Day. Palestinians mark the date as Nakba Day, or Day of the Catastrophe, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, their expulsion began. On Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu began celebrations of Israel's 70th Independence Day at a ceremony in Jerusalem with a nod to U.S. plans to move its embassy there from Tel Aviv.
We all praise the historic decision by President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as our capital and to move the embassy there of the world's biggest power. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, America.
On Wednesday, Trump tweeted best wishes to Prime Minister Netanyahu and all of the people of Israel on the 70th anniversary of your great independence. We have no better friends anywhere. Looking forward to moving our embassy to Jerusalem next month. For more, we're joined by Rashid Khalidi, Edward Said, professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University, the author of a number of books, his most recent, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. Talk about what's happening right now in Gaza. It's almost getting no attention in the United States. But this period of time leading up to March 15th.
May 15th.
May 15th.
It's remarkable that it's gotten as little attention as it has in this country because this is a new phase. It is almost entirely nonviolent. The Israelis try and focus on other issues, claiming that it is violent or people are throwing things or whatever. But you have literally tens of thousands of people walking to the fence, camping along the fence, carrying out protest activities, which are then met with a hail of hundreds and thousands of bullets. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, the hundreds of people who've been, the thousands of people who've been wounded, the dozens who've been killed. And what it shows is, I think, the Israeli security establishment is terrified of Palestinian nonviolence. Any narrative in which the Palestinians use violence is easy for them to master. But a narrative in which the Palestinians walk towards the fence and ask for their rights is one that they're very uncomfortable with.
But this isn't the first protest of its kind in Israel-Palestine, but is it the first one in which the Israelis have responded so disproportionately?
It's not the first of its kind. The most underreported story in Palestine is the nonviolent nature of an enormous amount of protest. We pay a lot of attention to violent actions, but the first Intifada was largely nonviolent. I mean, for 3 or 4 years, Palestinians were engaged in massive nonviolent protests, which were met with systematic repression. Rabin said, break their bones. That was his order to his soldiers when he was defense minister. So it's not the first time that the Israelis have used this kind of violence. I don't think that they've ever gotten to the point of shooting down literally thousands of people in this way. So maybe that's unprecedented.
And what do you think accounts for that?
They are very, very worried about two things. They're worried about the fact that the Palestinians might actually finally realize that nonviolent action is smarter and might be more effective. And secondly, they don't like one of the demands of this protest movement, which is the issue of return, because it brings up the issues that the Israelis hoped had been buried from 1948 onwards, which is to say their expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians back in April, May, and so forth of 1948, their confiscation of their property, and their refusal to allow them to return. And that's what this March of Return is about.
Are there additional demands?
That's the main focus of it. That is the main focus of it. I mean, almost the entire population of Gaza, with a very few exceptions, are refugees. And so they are living in this cooped-up, enormous prison camp right across the border from the lands that they once owned and cultivated.
So explain the organizing that went into this mass nonviolent protest that's happening particularly on Fridays after prayer.
Right. This started off as a civil society initiative, which was then, of course, cynically picked up by Hamas, which has realized the bankruptcy of its own approach and its unpopularity with Palestinians. But it started off as a movement by young activists who wanted to do something. They're living in this pressure cooker of Gaza.
Describe it.
They can't get out. They can't go anywhere. It's the highest population concentration on Earth. To get a permit to go to get medical care or to study abroad or to visit your family in the West Bank or Jordan is almost impossible for the overwhelming majority of Gazans. So they are imprisoned in Gaza. They're suffering without enough electricity. There's sewage. I mean, one could go on and on.
Let me go back to just some of the incidents that have taken place. Earlier this month, a Palestinian stepped forward to say he was the unarmed man who was shot by Israeli sniper in a gun site video recorded last December that went viral. Right. The video captures the sound of a gunshot, the Palestinian man falling to the ground, then a voice celebrating in Hebrew and cursing the sniper's victim. Tamer Abu Daqqa says he was shot in the leg without warning as he stood about 200 meters from Israel's fortified border. He told Al Jazeera he posed no threat to Israeli troops.
Some young people near the border were lying on the ground. They couldn't get out. So I came to protect them and asked them to go back. Then the Israelis shot me. How am I a danger to the Israelis? We were on our land. We didn't cross. I was in the buffer zone. I had no weapons in my hands. I had nothing.
Israel's military has criticized the soldiers who shot Abu Daqqa for cheering, but has defended the shooting itself, with Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman saying the sniper deserves a medal. And he not only said it for the sniper who shot him last December, but he's saying that no Gazan is innocent. Explain the significance of Avigdor Lieberman's statements and who he is.
This is part of a systematic defamation of the entire Palestinian people. I mean, what Lieberman and the security establishment is essentially saying is the Palestinians are a terrorist people, and whatever they do is beyond the pale. And I think the thing to focus on here is the use of snipers to gun down people at a sufficient distance from this. You could see in the video that we just saw, at a sufficient distance from the fence, that it is impossible that they could cause any harm to the Israelis themselves. So heavily armored Israeli soldiers with sniper rifles at hundreds of meters are picking off systematically Palestinian protesters or people who try to approach the fence or whatever. And that this is a policy that the government is proud of, that Lieberman is praising the snipers who've shot down literally thousands of people. I think it tells us a lot about Israel's attitude towards Palestinians, that they are subhuman.
Well, I think one of the perceptions that's quite common, I mean, you said earlier that Palestinians are now increasingly disenchanted with Hamas, and Hamas is not very popular in Palestine and with the residents of Gaza. So can you explain why people still have the sense, in fact, that the majority of Palestinians are sympathetic with or support Hamas, and how that sense kind of emboldens Israel to carry out the kinds of, I mean, this disproportionate violence of which we've been speaking?
I mean, if you go back and look at the way in which Israel has dealt with the whole issue of Palestine and the Palestinian national movement, they always demonize whatever appears to be the leading movement. When it was the PLO or Fatah or whatever, they were terrorists, they were beyond the pale, you couldn't talk to them. And the same is now true of Hamas. I think the interesting thing is not just Hamas. All of the political parties are discredited in the eyes of most Palestinians. They are seen to have failed. Hamas, with its policy of so-called policy of resistance, which in fact is a sham. Hamas prevents people from firing rockets from the Gaza Strip. It is carrying out, without a security agreement, the same kind of role of protecting Israel that the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is carrying out with a security agreement. And Palestinians see that. They see the cynicism of that, and they see that both sides, that is to say the PA in Ramallah and Hamas in Gaza.
So why is Hamas doing that?
And why are they doing that?
Yeah, why?
Out of fear of Israeli retaliation.
Is the reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas fracturing?
It doesn't seem to be going anywhere, sadly. I mean, this is the overwhelming demand of the Palestinian people, that these useless politicians get together and end this meaningless split so that the weaker party, the Palestinians, can at least present a unified front.
So let's talk about the journalists who have been killed. Let's talk about the Palestinian journalist Yasser Martaj, who was fatally shot by the Israeli army while covering the protest along the Israel-Gaza border. Photos show the 30-year-old journalist wearing a flak jacket, clearly marked press, at the time of the shooting. This is Martaj's mother and brother speaking after his killing.
I was next to him at the protest. Targeting the journalist was very clear, to the point that they targeted the two of us directly, using snipers and gas bombs.
We thought it was just an injury, and he will be injured for a while, and then God will heal him, and he will come out of it like the rest of the injured people. I didn't expect him to die.
Now, that's what happened in Gaza. Right. And then you have today's headline in West Bank. Press freedom groups are expressing alarm over the arrest of a journalist early Wednesday by Palestinian security forces. Relatives say the officers presented a search warrant, arrested Hazem Nasser without mention of what he's being charged with. He works for Najah Broadcasting Channel, which frequently covers Israel's demolition of Palestinian home, arrests of Palestinians. He's arrested in the middle of the night. Right. Martaj was killed.
I mean, I think the thing to say about the murder of this journalist and the murder of many of these people is that there is a policy of targeted assassination. It's not just snipers randomly shooting people. It is an intelligence system which collects information on everybody who's an activist, and these people are then being targeted. They are murdering specific people. They're not just shooting at random. They're doing that as well. But many of these killers, this is a wonderful book by a man named Ronen Bergman on Israel, the history of Israel's targeted assassinations. This is a policy of killing Palestinian leadership. They've been doing it for decades and decades. And now they realize that some of the most dangerous people are not people who are firing rockets, but rather people who are organizing popular demonstrations and nonviolent action.
But do you see any transformation or intensification of that policy on Israel's part as a consequence of Trump's election and his, I mean, one of the many steps that he says he's going to take is to move the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So what kind of message is that giving to Netanyahu and those who support him? I
mean, frankly, they've always had cover from Washington for whatever they did. But I agree, I think your question points to a reality, which is they have even greater impunity with a president like Trump, who will give them complete carte blanche for whatever they want to do.
And is moving the U.S. Embassy. The significance of that now, following the U.S. saying it's doing that in right around the 70th anniversary, Guatemala says it will follow suit.
Right. This is really very important. Jerusalem is the most important of all the issues in the Palestine-Israel conflict. And the Trump administration's decision that it recognizes, apparently from what they've said, the entirety of Jerusalem as sovereign Israeli territory has implications for the entire conflict. It has implications for the rest of the occupied territories. It has implications for Israeli annexations, not just of Jerusalem, of the Golan Heights, of other areas that they might choose to annex. So they are giving them a basically open season in terms of further annexations, further expansions, and so on and so forth, by this Jerusalem thing. It's not just recognizing Israel's capital as Jerusalem or moving the embassy. It has all kinds of other implications.
What will happen on May 15th?
The consulate in West Jerusalem will be turned into an embassy.
And what will happen at the wall, the Gaza-Israel wall?
I have no idea, but at the rate at which things are going, unfortunately, we're probably likely to see even more savage, vicious, brutal, murderous repression.
Well, Rashid Khalidi, we want to ask you to stay with us as we move on to Syria. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. His latest book, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. When we come back, we'll also be joined from London by Mohsen Beg, who was held at Guantanamo in Bagram in Afghanistan for several years, held by the U.S. military. This is Democracy Now! He also spent time in Syria over the last few years, and we'll talk to him about what he found there. Stay with us.
تعال شوفكم تحموا شوي ايدينا فوق مع الدربكه لحظه لا لسه عبد اكثر فوليوم خلينا نستحمى شوي هلا مع الدربكه ادي وين ما اروح بشوف
I Don't Have Freedom by the Palestinian hip-hop group Dam. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to Syria. International chemical weapons inspectors are still attempting to enter the town of Douma, where an alleged chemical gas attack killed dozens of people earlier this month. Inspectors with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons arrived in Damascus on Saturday, but have been unable to reach Douma and have accused Syrian and Russian authorities of blocking access to the town. On Wednesday, gunshots were fired at a UN security team in Douma. This comes days after the United States, France and Britain carried out airstrikes against 2 chemical weapons storage facilities and a research center in Syria. In response to the U.S.-led strikes, Russia announced it may supply Syria with a state-of-the-art air defense system, a move likely to anger the United States and Israel. Israel has carried out more than 150 bombing raids in Syria since 2011. Just last week, Israel bombed an Iranian air defense system at a Syrian base.
To talk more about the crisis in Syria, we're joined by 2 guests. Still with us in New York is Professor Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. And joining us in London is Mohsen Beg, former Guantanamo prisoner, held in extrajudicial detention by the U.S. government from 2002 to 2005, first held in Kandahar, then at the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan for approximately a year, before being transferred to Guantanamo. In 2011 and 2012, Mohsen Beg made several trips to Syria to investigate reports of U.S. and British rendition operations and to interview former prisoners of the Assad regime. Mohsen Beg works as outreach director now at the London-based organization CAGE, which advocates on behalf of victims of the war on terror. Mohsen Beg, it's good to have you back on Democracy Now! We interviewed you when we were in London and then again on various issues over the years. But right now, as the situation in Syria continues to deteriorate, can you talk about, one, what is happening now and your response to what's happening in Douma, the allegations that Syria was involved in a chemical weapons attack on the people, others saying it wasn't Syria, and others saying a chemical weapons attack didn't happen at all.
First of all, Amy, it's good to be back on Democracy Now! I think what's happening in Syria right now is one of the marked periods of our time when we will recognize that the denials that are taking place in relation to the massacres, not just in Ghouta or in Douma, but in fact what's been going on since the outset of the Assad regime and then his backers in Russia and Iran have been doing literally the deaths of 500,000 people. Today, 70 years after World War II, still the concept of somebody who denies the war crimes that took place at that time, the Holocaust or the genocides, will and can be prosecuted. But as we speak today, people are in complete denial of what's taking place live, though we've got, I mean, if we were just to put aside for one moment what took place in eastern Ghouta, that still leaves approximately 500,000 people dead. So essentially, with the usage of these chemical weapons, everything's being turned on to the discussion about this, as if the United States intervention has made any difference at all. And one thing I have to say, that whether it's the United States, whether it's Russia, whether it's the Gulf states, whether it's Britain or France, all have taken part in what I call the aerial gang rape of Syria. Everybody has bombed the opposition, and it's only now twice that the United States government has bombed Syrian military positions, and this latest one with the chemical facilities. Now, I'm completely against Western intervention because I've tasted firsthand what that can do and what it's done. But if you look at the strikes, literally, I think it's the first time in history that the Americans have bombed over 150 missiles together with the United States and France and killed nobody. Now, that's great, but perhaps they could extend this kind of deathless aerial bombing campaign to everybody else that they've been bombing, because thus far it's only the side of the rebels that the Americans have hit. They've hit, of course, ISIS, who are an atrocious organization that have committed war crimes, but they've also hit, by extension, anybody that fought alongside ISIS or prior to that other groups connected to them against the Assad regime. And there's never been an accountability for that. So all of this hype now, all of a sudden, that America has come in on the side of the Zionists and so forth. I mean, one of the things that I found really strange happening was when I tweeted out about the Ghouta massacre, was Nick Griffin, of all people. And Nick Griffin was the former head of the BNP, which was a racist organization, an openly anti-Muslim racist organization here in the UK, which is thankfully now dissipated. But he actually said to me, to quote, "Shame on you for pushing the propaganda of the Zionists while your brothers are being killed in Palestine." So here we have a far-right racist, a neo-Nazi almost, who is speaking on behalf of the Assad regime. In fact, in 2015, I believe, he went over to meet with the Assad regime to go and show his open support. So what you've got here is a completely unbelievable scenario of people who call themselves, on the one hand, anti-imperialist leftists, and on the other hand, far-right extremists who converge on this point in relation to Syria and call any dissident Muslim-based response to people like Assad terrorism. So everybody calls us terrorists now. It's not just the right. It's also people who claim to be on the left. So they're united in this view, and I think that that should be the litmus test now. So the language of the war on terror, whether it's China with the Uyghurs, whether it's Burma with the Rohingya, whether it's the United States with its policies of countering violent extremism, or whether it's the United Kingdom, Great Britain with its PREVENT program, the entire anti-terror legislation and language has been formulated based upon your position on Syria. So if you support the Syrian opposition, then at some point you're going to be regarded as a terrorist, either by the Assad regime or even by the West. And that is a paradox, if ever I've seen one.
Well, Muazzam, you've spent time in Syria in recent years, in 2012 and 2013, and you remain in touch with people who are in Syria, and notably in Idlib. So can you tell us what they've been telling you about what the situation is on the ground, and who they see as complicit in, let's say, the majority of war crimes, as you say, that are being committed?
And the significance of Idlib today.
So I'm in communication with aid workers and doctors who are working day to day, have been there for several years. Some of them are actually British citizens who've been living there at least 5 years. And I speak to them quite regularly, and my views and opinions not only based upon their experience, but my own, as you've rightly pointed out, in 2012 and 13. And what they're telling me now, of course, is that now that ISIS has started to disperse, though they're not completely defeated, they are feeling the push once more. So first of all, the doctor that I was speaking to told me that the majority of casualties they had coming into their hospitals were actually retreating ISIS fighters trying to force themselves and impose themselves into these other rebel-held territories. And they, of course, wouldn't accept that and fought them back, but at the expense of having their rear unguarded and open to attack by the Assad regime. And now, of course, they told me that they are treating wounded and internally displaced people who are coming into the Idlib region, evacuating from Douma and eastern Ghouta. So they believe now that Idlib will be the last bastion, and it will be essentially a place where all of these the powers of these governments that have air forces, Russia, and of course the Assad regime, and the Iranians will all gather for the final battle, and that will be a massacre. I believe, and I think if we base upon everything we've seen happening in Aleppo and indeed in eastern Ghouta, that if we thought what happened now was bad enough, what will take place in Idlib, unless there's some sort of a corridor that allows the evacuation, unless there's some kind of no-fly zone, I think it will be a massacre of unprecedented proportions if this wasn't already bad enough.
Talk about the significance of Idlib today, where it is geographically and where it is in relation to the opposition and the Assad regime.
So Idlib, when I was actually in Syria in 2012-13, Idlib wasn't in the hands of the opposition. It was still in the hands of the Assad regime. So it's in northern Syria, and it's not too far from the border with Turkey. The opposition, with a mixture of different groups, eventually took over and captured Idlib, and it's been in their hands for a while. They are bombed regularly by the regime. The people I've been speaking to told me that it's abated a little over the past few weeks, but it has been regular. At least 3 to 4 bombs land every few days. And, of course, the effect of that is the deaths of the civilian population. The refugee camps are bursting at the seams. There's simply not enough to provide for everyone. Many people are trying to, and have indeed. I mean, the largest number of refugees exist now in Turkey, Lebanon, and in Jordan, and all have tried to absorb these millions of refugees, both internally and externally. So the situation is dire. And when I spoke to a doctor yesterday, he told me, I just don't know how long I'll be here. I'm not going to leave this place because I've come to this place to save life however and whenever I can. And many of my colleagues are doing the same thing. But it's just a question of time before one of the regime bombs, one of the Russian bombs, one of the American bombs, one of the French bombs, one of the British bombs, or anybody else who happens to be taking part in this aerial gang rape of Syria hits us and kills us.
What do you think has to happen?
My view is this, at least, we know that in the Kurdish regions, for example, during the Iraq war, there were no-fly zones. Indeed, in Bosnia, I was in Bosnia during the war, the time there, and it was bad enough, but a no-fly zone at least stopped those who had air forces to carry out even further killing with the mass casualties. Now, I mean, one of the things that people need to understand that it's in modern warfare, any army, any air force that is operative against an enemy that doesn't have an air force will inflict far more damage. You take America in Vietnam, or the USSR in Afghanistan, or America in Afghanistan, or Iraq, and so on. You'll always find this. So whoever has air power must be brought at least to a position whereby they are pressured by other nations into not being able to drop bombs, which by definition are indiscriminate, other than the recent ones fired by America on the chemical facilities that actually didn't kill anybody. And that only happened, by the way, because America coordinated, orchestrated, and scheduled those strikes at 2 a.m. with their Russian counterparts. In other words, I've never come across this before, that you coordinate with your enemy in order that you can strike them so that there are no casualties.
Rashid, let's bring you in. First, do you agree with what Muazzam said about what needs to happen? First, your response to the U.S., British and French strikes, and then what you think needs to happen.
Well, I think the important thing that needs to happen is that this is a civil war and a proxy war. And the most, exactly as Muazzam Bey said, the most lethal part of it is the proxy war by these air forces, whether we're talking about the United States, Turkey, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so forth on one side, or whether we're talking about Russia and Iran on the other side. The only way to deal with this is to both address the political issues and get a proper regime in Syria in the place of the Assad regime, and most importantly, to end this external intervention. And that's going to require a completely different approach, not just by the United States, by a large number of countries, the Gulf countries and Turkey and other countries that are up to their ears in intervention in Syria. I mean, the Syrian war was not just a civil war. It was like the Lebanese war. It's like what's going on in Yemen and Libya. It's also a proxy war where major powers, Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, Iran, are up to their ears in intervention. And as Muazzam Bey said correctly, the most lethal part of that intervention is by air forces. So it's not, in my view, it's not just a matter of a no-fly zone. It's a matter of figuring out a way to de-escalate this conflict, get these external powers out, and have a proper political process whereby this atrocious regime can be replaced. I mean, one of the other problems is it's not just the millions of people who are refugees and who are terrified of going back because they're afraid of the regime. There are millions of people on the other side who are terrified of the opposition. So a political process is not going to be an easy business. But that's where we should be focusing.
And your response to the debate over the authorization for use of military force, the AUMF, that's going to be taking place in the Senate in the next few days? Any
obstruction to the untrammeled power of an imperial executive in this country is, in my view, a good thing. I think that the debate might lead to approval of the use of force. I think the president should be restricted as much as possible. The United States is fighting wars all over the world, in countries where I cannot see any possible interest for the United States or for world peace. And as Muazzam Bey has said, killing people because that's what happens in aerial bombardment. I was in Beirut in 1982. You bomb buildings, you kill people, whatever your target is, whatever your objective is.
Well, I want to ask about what what U.S. interests in Syria are. There's an article that was published earlier this week in the Boston Globe by Stephen Kinzer, who writes, quote, "The specter of a peaceful and prosperous Syria under Assad's leadership terrifies them," that is, American military and security advisors. They believe that until Assad is gone, it's in America's interest to keep Syria divided, unstable, and impoverished. According to the logic behind American strategy in the Middle East and the rest of the world, one of our principal goals should be to prevent peace or prosperity from breaking out in countries whose governments are unfriendly to us. So from what we know, Rashid, do you think that that is a determinant of U.S. policy in Syria? And if so, is it likely to change? What interest does the U.S. have in Syria?
I hate to say this, but I really think American policy in Syria has been totally incoherent. It's had some of the effects that Stephen Kinzer talks about, but I don't think that was a result of serious planning. I think that it's been, frankly, one of the most disgraceful episodes in American history, the way the United States has treated Syria. But that's actually true of Yemen. It's actually true of Libya. The United States has not acted in any way responsibly. These are conflicts that really should be brought to an end, and which the United States is feeding. In the case of Syria, obviously it's participating. In the case of Yemen, the United States is arming the Saudis and their allies, who are causing one of the greatest humanitarian disaster outside of Syria in the region. So, I mean, I would say that the effect is actually, as Stephen has said, we have 4 completely dysfunctional, or 3.5 completely dysfunctional countries in this region, largely as a result of external intervention: Libya, Yemen, Syria, and to a certain extent Iraq, All of these are places where the United States and its allies and other foreign powers have meddled, and they have created a unholy, absolutely unholy mess.
Mozambique, as we wrap up, I want to ask you about the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo, where you were held. Guantanamo opened by President George W. Bush when the U.S. launched its so-called war on terror. President Obama pledged to close it as one of his first acts after taking office in 2009, but Republicans repeatedly blocked his efforts. This is President Trump speaking in his first State of the Union address in January.
I just signed, prior to walking in, an order directing Secretary Mattis, who is doing a great job. Thank you. To re-examine our military detention policy and to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay. Asking Congress to ensure that in the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda, we continue to have all necessary power to detain terrorists wherever we chase them down, wherever we find them. And in many cases, for them, it will now be Guantanamo Bay.
Mozambique, as we wrap up and you listen to President Trump, scores of prisoners are still held at Guantanamo. You were released in 2005. The significance of Guantanamo, not only just what it's doing to the prisoners there now, but what it means as a symbol around the world.
I think if you remember recently, there were a couple of ISIS prisoners captured, two British guys apparently, who are now the custody of the Syrian Defense Forces. And these two individuals are accused of being involved in the execution of others, including American citizens, people like James Foley, who was a journalist documenting the oppression against the Syrian people. And what they're accused of having done to him is beheading him whilst dressing him in an orange jumpsuit. But what perhaps people don't know, what they did to him before that and to others, was they waterboarded him. Now, it's really important that we understand this, because the President of the United States of America has said openly that he will waterboard, and he would do a lot more than that. He believes torture works, and he will, as he has said, keep Guantanamo open, and he has signed an order to that effect. So let's just backtrack a little bit. The U.S. invaded Iraq as a result of the torture of a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who gave a false confession that he, al-Qaeda, his organization, were working with Saddam on obtaining weapons of mass destruction. That was used as a justification to invade Iraq. Al-Qaeda didn't exist in Iraq until the invasion, and they came in. Of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction. The U.S. military then set up prisons like Camp Abu Ghraib and Camp Booker, where they essentially Guantanamo-ized the prison system. So you had General Jeffrey Miller, who I met personally, who was responsible for my detention when I was held in Guantanamo, and then he went on to practice the techniques that he'd perfected in Guantanamo on Abu Ghraib. In Abu Ghraib and in Camp Booker, you had 17 of the leaders who later became ISIS leaders, of the 25 leaders, all graduate through the prisons of America. And lo and behold, they come out and started to practice the same torture techniques that were practiced upon them. So ISIS was born in the prisons of the United States of America. That was resulted from the torture that Donald Trump now says works and that he believes in. And his testimony, living testimony to that, is that to great applause, he says that he will keep that facility open. Well, Guantanamo has only destroyed whatever little reputation the United States had in terms of human rights in the rest of the world. There were countries chiding the United States of America from developing countries in Africa and elsewhere, saying that what right did the United States have to talk to us about detention without trial when it has Guantanamo sitting at its doorstep near Miami. So at least with Obama, with the Trump, you've got somebody who says what he believes in. Prior to this, You had the Bush administration who wouldn't even call it torture. They'd say it's enhanced interrogation techniques. They get their lawyers to redraft its entire meaning. The Obama administration said we won't torture anymore, we'll stop torture, but he ensured that anybody who was involved in the torture wouldn't be prosecuted. And that's why now today you have a president who feels that it's fine to endorse war crimes because he knows there is no precedent for a prosecution for saying this. So whichever administration, I think torture is as American as apple pie.
Well, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you for being with us, Mozambique, ex-Guantanamo prisoner, speaking to us from London, now outreach director at CAGE, released from Guantanamo in 2005, tortured by the U.S. military in Bagram in Afghanistan, and before that was brought to Kandahar. Also want to thank Professor Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
There's enough food to feed the world. Why wouldn't there so many of us? Are there people still alone? Why are the missiles called peacekeepers when they're aimed to kill? Why is a woman still not safe when she's in her home? Love is hate, war is peace.
Why? By Tracy Chapman, here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Tuesday marked the end of the inaugural Black Maternal Health Week, a campaign founded and led by the Black Mamas Matter Alliance. The effort was launched to build awareness and activism around the state of Black maternal health in the U.S. Here are a few sobering statistics that underscore the need for such a campaign. The United States ranks 32nd out of the 35 wealthiest nations in infant mortality. Black infants are now more than twice as likely to die as white infants, a disparity greater than existed in 1850, 15 years before slavery ended. Each year, an estimated 700 to 900 maternal deaths occur in the U.S., which is one of only 13 countries in the world where the rate of maternal mortality is worse than it was 25 years ago. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely to die from pregnancy-related causes as their white counterparts.
Black women and babies make up a significant number of the cases of infant and maternal mortality in the United States. These statistics were reported in a powerful new investigation in the New York Times Magazine called Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life or Deaths Crisis. Even more shocking is that, according to the report, and contrary to widely accepted research, education and income offer little protection. The answer to the disparity in death rates has everything to do with the lived experience of being a Black woman in America, says our guest, journalist and New York Times Magazine contributing writer Linda Virosa. She directs the journalism program at the City College of New York. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. A really powerful piece. Why are America's Black mothers and babies in a life or death situation today?
Well, when you go through the research, and I'm very interested in data and research, first you have to look at all the things that it is not. So you start to think, well, is it because Black women are not taking care of themselves? But then there's studies that say, oh, even when prenatal care is the same, then still Black women have low birth weight babies. And then it's sort of like, well, is there some kind of gene? Is there a genetic component? Then there are studies that say, no, actually, because when African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants come here, their babies are equal to white babies in size. But after a generation, then they start to look like African American babies, even when they're from the poorest countries. And so after a while, it starts to just say, well, actually, there is something else going on that has to do with being a Black woman in America.
Talk about what it is.
It is race and racism. So it's in 2 ways. One is just the lived experience of what happens to Black women in the country has a physiological effect. And there's a wonderful researcher in the University of Michigan who coined the term weathering. And so I love the term because it's very poetic. So it says it's like the weathering of a rock by the ocean, but it's also like the weathering a storm by a house, because it also speaks to resilience and resistance. But there is a physiological effect. So if you are stressed out, and I don't mean, oh, I'm so stressed out, the leaning kind of stress out, but repeated insults to your psyche over and over and over again, it revs up your system so that it actually starts to wear you down, the internal systems of your body. So that's part one of this, is the lived experience of being a black woman in America. The second is the way black women are treated in the healthcare system. And I say black women, but I mean black people. And this has been studied ad nauseum. I've read so many studies, my eyeballs want to fall out. But it's hard to get this across. And a lot of people will say, oh, the Tuskegee experiment, that's what it's about. And I said the Tuskegee experiment was years ago. We're talking about people who are being mistreated, ill-treated right now. And so if you combine the two and you take a woman who is essentially having a stress test to her body, which is pregnancy and childbirth, and you put her in this volatile situation where she's weathered and worn down by repeated insults, and then she's in a system that maybe isn't out for her best interest, you get a volatile mix.
And that would explain why neither education nor income substantially impacts the maternal health.
Well, I think what really explains it is, what really puts it into stark focus is what happened to Serena Williams. So Serena Williams had her baby in September, and after the baby was born, she started complaining about having shortness of breath. She had a history of pulmonary embolisms, which is a blood clot in the lungs. So she was ignored, and her concerns weren't taken seriously, and it led to a crisis. Presumably, this is one of the richest women in the world, and one of the most proactive and one of the most powerful, but still, her legitimate concerns were ignored at a hospital.
And she told the nurse exactly what she needed. She knew what she had. She said she needed a CT scan with contrast, an IV heparin, a blood thinner right away. The nurse thought her pain medicine might be making her confused. She insisted soon enough a doctor was performing an ultrasound on her legs. I mean, you have the ultrasound revealing nothing, so they sent for a CT. Sure enough, several small blood clots had settled in her lungs. She was right. Minutes later, she had the drip, and she said, I was like, listen to Dr. Williams.
Yes, please, the owner of your own body that you know best.
Well, in your piece, you also talk about your own experience. So could you tell us what happened in your case?
Well, what was interesting for me is I had read a study about college-educated women who have the higher rate of infant mortality, 75% related to low birth weight. So I'm thinking, okay, I didn't believe it at first because I was still under the assumption that this was strictly a problem of poor women, which is wrong and terrible, but I still thought, well, okay, I see this. But then when I got pregnant, I ended up, my baby was not progressing, was not large enough, given her gestational age. So my wonderful gynecologist said, you need to go on bed rest and you need to go to a specialist. So I went to the specialist, and the specialist was grilling me with all kinds of, do you use cocaine? Do you drink? And I'm the health editor of Essence magazine, so I am super into health. I'm very into fitness. I am trying to be a role model for good health and take care of myself and my baby. So I was really insulted. Do you have all these different kinds of illnesses? I'm like, no, I'm fine. And then I looked up what I had called intrauterine growth restriction, and it is something that is associated with women who are not taking care of themselves, smoking, drinking, using drugs, or ill. And so I thought, what is wrong with me? It turned out my baby was better not inside of me, but on the outside. So I had her induced right at term. She was low birth weight. Low birth weight is 5.5 pounds. She was 4 pounds, 13 ounces. She is fine now. She's a healthy, smart, athletic college student.
We have 10 seconds.
But I thought, is this because of my lived experience of being a Black woman in America?
We're going to do part 2 of this discussion, and we're going to post it online at democracynow.org. Linda Villarosa directs the journalism program at City College of New York, contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. We'll link to her piece, Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life-or-Death Crisis. That does it for our show. I'll be speaking in Lincoln, Nebraska on Friday night. Check our website. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.